Welcome to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology Podcast, a podcast hosted by Marcelo Aevi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland, and Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium. We aim to draw a map of the state of criminology across Europe through the words of contemporary criminologists. How is criminology defined and taught? Which are the main lines of research? Which are the main schools of thought in each country? These and many other questions are answered here by fellow researchers who share their vision on the development of criminology in their countries from its beginnings to the second decade of the 21st century. If you want to know and compare their stories, stay tuned.
Today we are interviewing Gorazd Meško. Gorazd Meško is professor of criminology and has worked at the Faculty of Criminal Justice and Security since 1992 at the Maribor University in Ljubljana in Slovenia. He is head of the department. He is a former president of the American Society of Criminology and was principal investigator in many research projects in many areas, amongst other legitimacy and procedural justice and juvenile delinquency. He received many awards, amongst others the Freda Adler Distinguished Scholar Award by the American Society of Criminology in 2022 for his significant contribution to the development of international criminology. This interview was conducted on the 16th of December 2022.
Welcome, Gorazd Meško, to Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology Podcast.
Welcome, Gorazd. We are very pleased to have you here and listen to the history of criminology in Slovenia.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
Okay, well, as you know, we in our podcast have prepared a couple of questions which we discuss, and the idea is to have the general idea about the evolution, developments in several European countries. And the first question we always ask is probably the most difficult to answer, but it's about how one defines criminology in Slovenia.
Yeah, so this is, I would say, a very provocative question because we have many definitions of criminology. Some of them are translated from English and some of them are homemade. So, and it's also important from which period you want me to talk about those definitions. So if I go back to the 50s, when the Institute of Criminology was established at the Faculty of Law in Ljubljana, they used the so-called criminal law criminology definition, which consisted of general theory, history, dogmatic, comparative criminal law, crime control policy, criminology, also comprised of criminal phenomenology, biology, psychology, sociology, and also was related to some other related disciplines like forensic medicine, forensic psychiatry, criminalistics, criminal investigation, penology, criminal pedagogy, and crime prevention. So this was one of the first definitions. And we have even a longer one by Professor Schellich and Professor Bautson from the 90s, but I never require my students to learn the letter by heart because we usually read it and then try to analyze it. But we also have other definitions. So one of definition of my professor Janez Pečar, I think is the shortest one. So he added his definition to my criminology textbook from 1998, and he stated that criminology was a discipline for a better understanding of crime and its curbing. And then I think we had the most provocative one by a very good friend and colleague of mine, Zoran Kanduc, who is a critical criminologist. And he says that criminology is a discourse in which everything is questionable, including what criminology is or what it is supposed to be. because of its multidisciplinarity, eclecticism, and so on. So, and it's also related to different traditions of criminology, different schools of criminology, and different levels of explanation, crime, criminality, societal responses to crime, and so on. So his definition seems to be very provocative, but when he describes it in detail and explain the main reasons for being a little bit or quite provocative, then you can learn a lot about the history of criminology, the development of criminology, different schools of criminology, and the impact of criminological research on policy making and contribution of national criminologists to global or international knowledge about crime, criminality, and so on.
That's quite a lot, but you mentioned the first definition related to the history of the institutionalization of criminology in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
So you mean that this way of thinking was the way it was done since the 1950s? Do I understand it right, that since this period, criminology has been institutionalized as a school of thought or as a department where criminological sciences?
I think we can talk about institutionalizing of criminology since the mid-50s. But we have to go back a little bit further, because in 1917 we had a great novel published by the first Austro-Hungarian judge for juveniles, who actually was able to observe the social problems, demographic characteristics of the families and children he dealt with. All these social psychological problems in many families that came to his court with the juvenile delinquents and so on, and he published the first I would say criminological reflection on juvenile delinquency, entitled "Birds Without the Nest." So some people call him proto-criminologist or pre-criminologist, yeah, because he was a judge, but his reflection on social problems was extremely good, yeah. And then after the end of the October Revolution in Russia, Russian scientists fled from the country, and one of them came to Slovenia in the 20s, and he, I would say, established a criminological school in Ljubljana, because his influence of his works between 1927 and 1947 was extremely strong, and I would say it impacted the future development of criminological research and criminological thought in Slovenia a lot. He was a great guy, and I would say that he was also very productive. He wrote pieces on protection of neglected children as a part of social policy, accountability in criminal law, pedagogical aspects of juvenile justice, crime control policy and criminal personality, sociology of crime and ethics, institutes of criminology that they were mainly institutes of criminal investigation or criminal justice institutions at the time, crime patterns and crime typologies, criminal geography, crime in newspapers, women and crime, and juvenile delinquency. He also published the first textbook on criminology in Slovenian language in 1947, but regretfully he died the next year. But he had a great student who later on continued his tradition in the 50s. There is also something what needs to be mentioned. You know that Slovenia used to be a republic of former Yugoslavia, and we had a very specific situation in the beginning of the 50s. So the Ministry of the Interior, like in many other countries, established their own institute of something, I don't know, it was just called the research unit of the Ministry of the Interior. But very soon they learned that researchers and the politicians, and especially state bureaucrats, cannot work together. So it was very interesting that the government actually suggested, I would say more required, to move people from the Ministry of the Interior to the Ljubljana University and establish the Institute of Criminology later on. So it was very interesting that there was a need for the move of researchers from the Ministry of the Interior, recognized by the responsible people in the government because of different perspectives on crime, criminality, and social control, and so on. And the idea was that the Ljubljana University establishes a completely independent scientific research institute that would, I would say, also give advice to the government, but from a perspective of an academic freedom and so on. So, and in the 1950s, they were also quite advanced because we have to put everything what was going on in the context. It was 5 years after the end of the World War II, and the Ministry of the Interior started publishing a circular, an internal newsletter called the Criminal Investigation Services. And it was, I would say, a very interesting publication, intended mainly for high-ranking police officers and especially police detectives who learned about crime, criminality, successful cases of criminal investigation, opinions of prosecutors, judges, and so on. And also in some issues, there were some ideas about criminological research and perspectives from the West. So this was, despite the fact that, it was I would say, in the times of socialism or communism, Western ideas actually slowly approached the Slovenian criminological thought. And it was even more intense later when the institute was established, because many colleagues who worked there, so they were mainly my professors in the past, and they also traveled quite a lot to foreign countries, and they tried to learn from the best. So we also followed about the same idea, and I can talk about that a little bit later. But why this criminal investigation services circular is so important? Because it was highly classified in the first years, in the first 9 years to be precise, and then this publication was renamed into the Journal of Criminal Investigation and Criminology, which is still existing, and I'm the editor-in-chief of this journal. And this is one of not so many journals which are not in English, published in English, but they are listed in Web of Science and Scopus. So this is due to the long tradition of publishing, I would say, high-quality journal. And there's also a paradox, because it's called Criminal Investigation and Criminology, but I can tell you that the majority of papers are what is considered nowadays criminology, and very little is about criminal investigation. So this is, so the title should be Criminology and Criminal Investigation, if we take into consideration the number and the quality of papers. But it's the journal published by the Ministry of the Interior, and we edit and publish it jointly with Division or Department of Criminal Investigation, because of its origins from the 50s. So this is a little bit about the past and present.
Yeah, but that is also one, Gorazd, of the 60 criminology journals that have a recognized impact factor, in the sense that they were included in what was before the Social Science Citation Index, And I think, I mean, Slovenia has 2 million people, and one of these journals is there. And outside the English journals, you have only one French journal, Deviance Société, and you
Yes.
have the Monastry für Kriminologie from
Yes.
Germany, and that's all, if I'm not wrong. Eh?
Yeah, I think so. Yes, you're right. Yeah. So this is the journal. Yes. And we try to keep a very high quality of publications. And after 2014, we publish an issue a year in English language to increase our impact factor, or to increase our visibility, to put it correctly. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the idea. But it started long time ago. We are just continuing a good tradition of high quality publications. And what is also important for this journal, the main research and the main research findings from criminological research projects conducted at any institution in the country are usually published as a research paper. So this is also very good. So if you read the journal, you can see the development of research, the main findings, and how those research priority complement the development of criminological research and thought in Europe or elsewhere. So I think this is also very important. And yeah, so there have been different periods or eras of research at the Institute of Criminology in the past. I think I'm not able to fully cover it because I read it in publication, so I haven't lived that period of time. But I listened to my professors who taught me about their research in the past, and I would say, as a diligent PhD student, I did my homework. So I didn't study just the criminological literature published in English, but I did read everything, almost everything, I could say, what had been published in the Slovenian language before that, including all works of the founder of Slovenian criminology, Maklecov, early writings of the Slovenian authors, and also the first issues of the criminal investigation services circular. And I also did something. We also scanned all issues of the journal from 1959 on, and the entire journal, all papers published in the journal, are available open access. Yeah. Wow. So on the internet, and I think this is a huge contribution to the future researchers, and which actually can help them to study much faster than we did before. Yeah. So I think this is quite a user-friendly approach. And this is, I would say, a good use of modern technology to facilitate studying in this field.
You will be celebrating next year how many years of the Institute?
So the Institute of Criminology was established in 1954. So in 2024, they will be celebrating 70 years.
70 years.
Yeah. But I work at another institution, and we are celebrating 50 years next year. And maybe I can tell you also something about our institution, because it's about complementary research, or I would say that the Institute of Criminology covers specific topics because it's located at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ljubljana. They have a very long tradition of all kinds of criminological research. But at our institute, we mainly focus on empirical research, not so much on theoretical perspectives, not so much on philosophical perspectives, not so much on critical and radical criminological perspectives, but we are trying to contribute to empirical research. And so my big ambition is also to contribute a lot to international comparative research. So that's what we are trying hard. So I've been working now for 30 years and a couple of months at the Faculty of Criminal Justice and Security of the Maribor University, but there is a teeny tiny trick. So we belong to the Maribor University, which is located in Maribor, the second largest city of Slovenia, but our school or our faculty is located in the capital city of Ljubljana. It actually is a big advantage because we also have many students, but on top of having many students, we in the times of after 2004, when we had to unify and harmonize curricula and adapt to the Bologna Convention of higher education, so we had to become a fully fledged, I would say, European university, and in this particular perspective, research is very important. And we also have a PhD program since 2007. And the institute I'm heading at the Faculty of Criminal Justice and Security was established in 2004, so it's now been 17 years. And I can tell you that I'm very proud because all of my colleagues have been very active. We have contributed quite a lot. And as I mentioned before about the colleagues at the Institute of Criminology, from their early developments and their ambition to learn from the best in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on. So from the 90s on, when our institution became one of the players in the field of criminology in the country, we also try to do the same, but in a little bit different topics. So in the beginning, we did mainly research on police and policing. Then we moved to criminal investigation and studying crime patterns. And we also studied all kinds of these new technologies, how to analyze crime, criminality, like GIS and all these analytic approaches. Then we were, I would say, very lucky to be invited to the CrimPrev project between 2006 and 2009, which was, I would say, like, so if I use an analogy from the Star Trek TV series, it was like catching up with the best and going beyond the frontiers of the universe. And because we never expected that fast and intensive development before. So this CrimPrev project was, I would say, a warp speed jump into the future. We learned a lot from colleagues from all over Europe. We learned what were our abilities and capabilities, be it individual or institutional. And we also contributed 2 publications to this CrimPrev project. One was actually 2 edited books. One was about crime prevention and crime policy, and another one was about crime, fear of crime, and contemporary perspectives on understanding crime and the role of media in contemporary society, in so-called creation of social construction of realities about crime and criminals. What was actually also very important for us was that we learned to cooperate with colleagues from well-established universities all over Europe, because if you are just a beginner, a rookie, and you work with well-established scholars, there's a lot to learn, a lot to catch up. And like our basketball player Luka Doncic said when they asked him, what do you have to learn to become a better basketball player? And he replied, a lot, sir. So it was a very intensive period of time. We also contributed something to a wider criminological audience or community. So I think this was one of the best projects in the history of our institute.
Perhaps we should say maybe just a couple of words about that. CrimPrev was a project funded by the European Union, headed by the GERN, if I remember correctly, I'm sure. Groupement Européen de Normativité de Recherche, donc an international group based in France. Probably I mentioned the name wrong. And the idea was to have a sort of state of the art of what we know about crime and criminology in general. I think it's one of the, I mean, Gorazd, in your whole life, have you heard a lot of people talking as positive as you are talking about any project funded by the European Union?
I'm not talking about bureaucracy and technicalities of the project. That's something completely different.
Yeah, but the results, I mean,
but the results were extremely good. Yeah.
So that is what is I'm trying to highlight the fact that there are many projects, that someone makes a report. There are a lot of institutes specialized in this kind of thing and disappear. And this is one that left
footprint.
Exactly, a footprint. So it is quite interesting. I participated also in that project, and I also have a very good souvenir. I remember that they were complaining about the administrative work, but a lot of publications in open access, most of them. So
it was also a great benchmarking, as the managers would say, for our institution, because we entered into this, I call it academic or research adventure with 15 colleagues from our institution. But at the end, when we had to deliver the results, it was just 3 of us. So it was also a good sign that some colleagues had to learn and try a little bit harder. Yeah, we upgraded this experience later on, and it actually served us to become recognized as a research institution, and we also learned what needed to be learned in addition to what we also had known. Yeah, so it was really good. But there were also other research projects, European research projects we took part in, but I cannot compare any other project with this GERN CrimPrev. It was a coordinated action. It was not a research project. It was the exchange of ideas and learning about the state of the art of criminological research in the European countries. So this was extremely useful for all of us. Yeah, that's I think is very important.
Yeah. Gorazd, I also have a question about this. The institute created 70 years ago and then 50 years ago. That was part of former Yugoslavia. How was the issue of communication? Which was the I suppose the common language was Serbo-Croatian, but you mentioned publications in Slovenian, eh?
Yeah, okay. So there are some very special moments in the history of Slovenian criminology. You just mentioned the language which was used as one of the official languages. In addition to Serbo-Croatian, each republic had its own language. Yeah. So in Slovenia, we spoke and wrote Slovenian language only. We never used Serbo-Croatian language for the official purposes, but we all actually had to learn at least 1 year this Serbo-Croatian language. Something what was very interesting to me, if I remember correctly, in 1968, the Slovenian authors published the first criminology textbook, not in Slovenian language, but in Croatian language, and they published it in Croatia. So this was, to me, this was very unusual, because people usually publish textbooks in their native languages, but later on they also published a collection of papers and then criminology textbooks and so on in the Slovenian language. I can tell you that the Slovenian Institute of Criminology, the Ljubljana Institute of Criminology, differed quite a lot from research priorities, paradigms, perspectives, differed a lot from other institutes in the federal Republic of Yugoslavia. From my perspective, I would say that they were extremely advanced in the times when it was said that the borders were closed, that there was no flow of information, and so on. Once again, maybe if I remember it correctly, I gave this presentation at the ESC conference in 2009 in Ljubljana, and I was talking about our senior scholars traveling all over the world. So, starting with the director of the institute, one of the first directors of the institute, Katja Vodopivec, she went to the United States and learned about social policies. And if I remember correctly, one of the seminar we had, she brought some ideas from the States. But during the socialist times, this was a little bit tricky, you know. So this was presented as a socialist idea, yeah. But it was at the times of the Kennedys' war against poverty. Janez Pečar, my mentor at our school, spent some time in Philadelphia with Torsten Selin in 1965, long time ago. So Professor Alenka Šelić spent some time in Cambridge and then at Max Planck Institute and in Wisconsin in the States and so on before 1991. I have to emphasize this. And Professor Balzon, a leading scholar in the field of human rights, spent some time in Nancy in France. And a colleague who did research on juvenile delinquency and children's rights spent some time at Kalamazoo, I think at School of Social Work in Michigan, in the States. I think Kalamazoo is in Michigan. And another mentor of mine, Professor Brins, did his PhD research in Paris, and he studied penal systems in France and Slovenia and so on. And also one of our colleagues from the institute, from the early ages of it, Professor Maver, he spent some time in Leningrad, nowadays St. Petersburg in Russia. So our scholars actually traveled quite a lot, you know, and they tried to learn a lot from other scholars, policymakers and practitioners and so on.
But it's quite interesting that you mentioned Annecy. You know that Annecy is very near the border with Geneva.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that there was something going on criminology or crime-related sciences in Annecy. Now that I will check this, but I am surprised about this. So there was someone working there. Yeah, this gives me a hint that I would like to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but if I go further after the 90s, so it was when I started working as an assistant at the Higher School of Internal Affairs at the time. It was also very interesting that for example, Professor Pečar wrote a letter of recommendation to the Institute of Criminology, to the director of the Institute of Criminology in Cambridge, because he was a good friend of Leon Radzinovic. And he said, Meško, it's the best to go there and learn from the best, or go to Max Planck in Freiburg, because they are also doing high quality research. And what is the most important for you, they have the best libraries in Europe, yeah, the Radzinovic library and the library at Max Planck in Freiburg. So, and I can tell you that I remember having this conversation with him, and he said that the best friend of researcher is a librarian. So, and I said, okay, so this is very interesting, and I now can tell you that he was absolutely right. Yeah.
It is quite interesting what you say there, because it's something that we discussed also with Martin Kilias. I think Lieven in the interview. I think it was in the interview for the podcast, but I'm not sure that that somehow, for example, the Max Planck for criminology Of course, it remains a reference, but it lost a little bit its attractive because now that you have the access online to many things,
Yeah.
this role is changing. You know that during my studies in Switzerland, I work at the library to pay my studies, and so I love libraries, and I fully agree with the idea that the best friend of a researcher is the librarian. But these librarians are somehow disappearing a little bit because everything is done through the internet. And I remember, of course, Phyllis Schultz at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey, and she played a major role in everything, and she was doing the reviews of literature for all these persons. And yeah, I was wondering how this has changed. How do you see this influence on your students, your PhD? You still send them abroad, but maybe this has changed a little bit, no?
Yes, I agree with you. So I still trust librarians most when it comes to helping me to find some specific literature, especially I think I need to start this a little bit differently. Nowadays, you can find almost anything on the internet, but I learned that some students forget to read basic literature. It's mainly about finding contemporary or recent electronic versions of publications. And I remember one of those World Criminal Justice Librarian Network meetings I attended. I think it's 17 or I don't know how many years now.
Ah, you attended one of these meetings.
Yes, yeah,
nice.
because Phyllis was also there, and I also went to Rutgers, and I spent a short period of time there, and so on. And she explained me this idea of doing a literature review, cataloging articles, and helping researchers, and so on. So I think that in the past 20 years, the role of librarians has changed quite a lot. Yeah, because we can do a lot of work by ourselves online. And I remember that some libraries were renamed into documentation centers and so on. And this has a completely different meaning. I remember that from one of my trips. But if I talk about my students actually learn how to find literature on the internet. But it depends at what university you study, because it depends on the number of subscriptions. Yes. So if you are, so I know that I remember when I was in Cambridge for the first time, I depended on the librarians a lot, and they helped me a lot. So I still remember that I had to pay something like, I don't know how much money it would be now, but it was a double price of my airplane ticket to London and back, because I had a bag full of photocopies of articles. And nowadays we simply, if you don't have the article available at your university, you simply ask a colleague if he has, the one who wrote the paper, if he can share it with you, and so on. But there are also other options like ResearchGate and Academia Edu and so on and so on. And this process seems to be a little bit faster than in the past. What I've been observing recently is that when it comes to a literature review about a specific field of research, students, because they mainly read articles, they forget about books. Yeah, so that's something what I need to remind them sometimes.
Yeah, it's funny because Umberto Eco, already in the 80s, I think, he published an article about this. At that time, it was this, everybody was desperate to make photocopies, and you were making Xerox copies, and then he said, you make all this, and then you will never read them. And I think at least at that time when you were making that was a problem already there. But at least when you were making the Xerox copies, you, and maybe Xerox is not the right one because I'm making advertisement for one company, but
okay.
so let's say that these photocopies, you were at least going through the paper, but
Yes.
many people now, including me, of course, you just see the title and the answer and say, okay, this is interesting, and you download it, and then of course some of them you never reach them, and you don't even know what is really inside of them. So it is a big change in the way we interact with the research that is already published, and maybe we should try to see. Phyllis Schulze is now retired, but maybe she will be someone very interesting to interview.
Yes, about the changing culture of reading
And the
doing
creation
literature
of the
review.
library. Yeah, it's
Just to mention Phyllis once again, when I actually I started to get acquainted with comparative international criminological research, I asked her to help me with the literature review and the papers available on this topic, and she was very helpful. So I think I have done quite a lot in this field for a person who works in such a young research institution. But it started with a regular librarian. Yeah.
The thing is that, well, I don't want to go outside of the goal of the podcast, but this also that kind of librarian who was going and placing the books in different parts, this is now changing. The new generation of librarians have to deal mainly with electronic documents, and the way in which they are receiving their education is a little bit it's not a little bit, it's quite different. And many institutions, for example, here, one of the libraries, they are going mainly to everything that is online. We don't buy the paper, and so all the relationship with the sources is disappearing, and this is a kind of knowledge that is disappearing. The classic librarian that knew everything will have a different profile in one generation, in 20 years.
Yeah, maybe I can add something from the Slovenian perspective. So the technical editors of the Journal of Criminal Investigation in the past were librarians working at the Institute of Criminology at the Faculty of Law in Ljubljana. And one of them was a copy editor, another one was a language editor, but both of them were very well educated in the field of languages and so on. But they knew almost everything about Slovenian criminological research because they did all literature reviews, they prepared materials for researchers, and they read all submitted papers to the journal in addition to the editor-in-chief and other members of the editorial board. So from a perspective of the development of criminology, those librarians were incredibly useful for the development of criminological research, and their contribution to the criminological thought was also very good because they published papers on literature and criminology and so on, and some other pieces. Also, one of them published a very provocative paper about the use of language, because English became lingua franca, so the language of research globally. And the paper was entitled "Publish in English or Perish," because all academic promotion in the country depended on publications in top journals or books published by international publishing companies. This was, I would say, a very, very, very painful period of time, quite frustrating, and it took us quite a while to adapt to new pressures. I also remember a very provocative statement of the rector of our university some 15 years ago. He said, "Meško, you probably know everything about academic freedom. You may forget it because we now live in times of academic production." And I said, okay, so I'm academically free to be very productive. Am I right? So
And that's quite impressive. So we had a nice introduction to everything that is institutions in Slovenia. And what about the programs in criminology at the universities?
okay, so criminology in the past was taught at several schools or several faculties. So I would say that the most influential school was the Faculty of Law at the University of Ljubljana, which had postgraduate studies still have, in criminology, in addition to criminal law. So people who did not have a legal background, when they pursue their postgraduate studies, they got a degree in criminology. And we also have other schools where it's not called criminology, but it's called very close to what criminology is actually in some other countries. So one of these schools is our faculty, because we do criminal justice and security studies. But if we follow those international classification of higher education disciplines and so on, this is most of it. What we do is still quite criminological. And if we follow a definition of criminology by the European Society of Criminology, I would say that more than half of teaching we do at our school is criminology related. But then it depends what is the real substance of it. Yeah. There is a little bit of criminology at School of Social Work. Yeah. And there's also a study called social education at the Faculty of Education at the University of Ljubljana, which before 1991 was called defectology for behavioral or conduct disorders and something like that, behavioral problems. It was a kind of I call it a socialist positivist criminology, yeah. And it was meant for people who work with juvenile delinquents, who got a job in prisons as rehabilitation workers and so on, yeah. And this program was very interesting because colleagues from professors and researchers from the Institute of Criminology taught criminological subjects on this program, yeah, and now it's called social education, and the orientation is completely different. So in the past it was a little bit of psychology, a little bit of psychology, a little bit of medicine, a little bit of pedagogy, a little bit of general subjects, and quite a lot of research methods and statistics, yeah. And dealing with juvenile delinquents and homeless people and so on. So it has changed a little bit since the end of 80s. Yeah. So the only institution where you can get a degree in criminology is the Faculty of Law. At our university, you can get any degree in criminal justice and security. But we also have other degrees, you know. We have like a BA degree in policing and security, BA degree in information security, and then BA in criminal justice and security, and master's degree in criminal justice and security, and PhD in criminal justice and security. And criminology is one of the core subjects in every course, you know, I just mentioned. Yeah.
So it's both at the bachelor and master level.
And PhD, yeah.
And PhD, but we'll talk about PhD programs later on. The reason I ask is because some people have divergent opinions on the best strategy to either have both bachelor programs and master programs in criminology, or just focusing on the master programs. The advantages would be that you don't have to learn the basics, and you can concentrate on research, and you have people who already know about methodology and theories so that you can move on. But on the other hand, it's also related to resources, the number of students and faculty resources. So I don't know, what do you think about this discussion?
Yeah, okay. So we've been there in 2004 when we joined the University of Maribor at the time, and we had to adapt programs, university programs, to the Bologna Convention of Higher Education. You probably both know that I headed this European Society of Criminology working group on academic university curricula, so we discussed these issues quite a lot. So I learned at the time that Europe was so diverse in this perspective that it's impossible to unify and harmonize everything regarding the curricula and the subjects and so on an undergraduate level because of different legislations, different employability, different ideas of training people, and so on. It was a little bit easier on the master's level because it, as Lieven, you mentioned, it was about research, developing basic research skills, and so on. And master studies are usually more open for people who come from all walks of life, from different disciplines. And sometimes it's good to have a mix, of people who have BA in sociology, BA in psychology, or I don't know, any other discipline. And then they continue their studies in the field of criminology, trying to cover a variety of perspectives, but they received quite a good training in research methods and statistics, or to be on the path to become future researchers. At our school, we mainly have, I call them reoffenders. They do BA studies with us, they do master studies with us, and then also they do their PhD with us.
Okay.
Yeah, but we love them a lot because they're usually very diligent young people and very ambitious and willing to learn. The main problem I have faced with this mixed group of postgraduate students or second and third degree is that if you have a student who finishes BA in, I don't know, in our case, in criminal justice and security, and he passes subjects like criminology, basics of victimology, basics of penology, basics of crime prevention, and so on, when they continue their studies on master's level, it's quite easy for them to upgrade their knowledge. And when you work with students who come from other fields of studies, you have to start from the very beginning, and you have to individualize teaching for them. And sometimes I see that for some students, it's very difficult to catch up. Yeah, and but usually it's not a big number of them, but they who come and study with us, those from other faculties, other programs, are also quite motivated or very motivated. Yeah, but I see that they need some additional explanation or a little bit of work with them and so on. It's a little bit different with PhD studies because when we started our PhD in 2007, PhD program, we learned something very special after 4 years, that we need a so-called comprehensive exam. Because the first generation of our doctoral students, they didn't have to take this comprehensive exam. We call it rigoros. It's the a subject that covers like 5, 6, 7 topics of from different subjects. And because it happened to us that one of the PhD graduates completed her studies without doing any specific criminal justice and criminology subjects. She just did what was in the program, and she wrote her PhD dissertation, which was of a very high quality. But if you asked her about the main ideas in criminology and so on, she had no clue. Yeah. So she was extremely specialized in her topic, but a general knowledge about criminological theories, research, and so on, I think it would take her another year or two to learn about it. Yeah. So these were some experiences from the past, and there was also something in the field. On a PhD level, we started with a 3-year program, and now we have a 4-year program, because we have also have a PhD school at the university. Colleagues who are responsible for PhD program at different faculties are also members of this PhD school. And this school, I would say, is quite centralized. So requirements are extremely high. And the main idea is to produce or to help build future researchers and academics, because the student has to publish at least one paper in a top Web of Science journal to be allowed to defend their PhD dissertation. On top that, the dissertation is already completed, yeah, and approved by the committee, yeah. So this is about those new high standards. And we also, what is, I would say, very useful, we also do something after we adopted or modified our programs to the Bologna Convention ambitions. I call them ambitions. We have a very interesting approach that we can invite practitioners, policymakers, and other experts to up to 10% of teaching hours of each subject. So, for example, if I have a subject of 60 hours, I can invite people from practice, policy making, or some other experts to teach with us for up to six hours. This is also very good because it's about learning about the social context, not just reading papers from abroad. What I was sometimes very cynical about some ideas of contemporary social control, because our students knew a lot about American community policing, but they had no idea about local and national police force of Slovenia. So it's about contextualization. It's about learning about social reality in our country. And it's also about knowing and learning what is actually going on abroad. And on top of this, we also take students to field visits to other countries. We organize joint conferences with other universities in English. For example, on master's program, we have an annual conference on local safety and security with the Faculty of Law in Podgorica in Montenegro. And our students present papers, and Montenegrin students present paper, but not only them. We also have Erasmus Plus students who come and study with us for a semester, and we also invite them to join us. And this year I will have a visiting researcher who will join us on this conference. And we are trying to facilitate our students and provide them with a safe environment to practice presentations in English, because we are not as harsh as sometimes native people can be about proper English and so on. I can tell you that this is very useful, and it's not only about the subjects they are covering in their presentations or at the entire conference, but it's also about learning about other academic environments, about other professors from other countries, students, and they also give us a great tour of criminal justice institutions, and it's usually a very nice experience. Yeah, so we are going to Montenegro again in April 2023. So the past two conferences were online, but as you know, almost all conferences were online in the past 2 years. I think this is quite a good approach. Yeah, and I also take my students. So we are just wrote a history of our chair of criminology. It's 3 people of us at the chair of criminology at the Faculty of Criminal Justice and Security. It is Rok Hacin, a colleague of mine, a very ambitious young scholar. Katja Eman, who graduated on a PhD program, I think, 10 years ago, and is also very ambitious and contributes a lot in the field of environmental crimes and some specific fields related to something what I call unconventional deviance. I also have a junior research fellow who helps me to do ISRD4. Our idea is to do so-called research-based teaching, for all subjects, BA, MA, or on PhD level. So that's our idea, and I think it works quite well. It's quite a demanding approach, but at the end of the day, I think we all are quite happy. And I think it's good to know what is going on globally, especially good research, good pieces of research that fit into our value system and so on. For example, Rok and I have been doing research on legitimacy in prisons and self-legitimacy of prison workers now for 7 years, and we did some very nice publications. We published some nice publications, not only in English but also in the Slovenian language. We also try to convey our research results and literature reviews we do to the practitioners, mainly to the Slovenian prison administration, and try to help them to improve the quality of their services. And recently we did a research project on self-evaluation of professional competencies and self-legitimacy of the prison staff in Slovenia. And this project is very useful for the Slovenian prison administration, also for a subject penology. We teach, actually Rok teaches on the BA level, because it's up to date, it is related to the Slovenian prison system, and on top of it, we did a very profound literature review, and it can be also considered a good start for the future project. And Marcelo, this project we've been developing on penal policies from the past, present, and in the region, and so on. And this is another topic which hasn't been covered fully, from all kinds of perspectives. We usually speak about, when we talk about penal policies. So I gave an assignment to my students to find a written penal policy, a document which is called a penal policy. But then you see that it's implication of the criminal code, criminal proceedings, all kinds of practices, and so on. And we learned that there's something what we need to study more in detail to know what processes are behind these policies. So this is one of the approaches we are using, and what I'm very proud of, we include our students to almost all research projects. And some of students are doctoral students, some of them are master students, some of them are also BA students. So it's really, I think this is a good approach, but it requires a lot of care, attention, and responsibility, and mainly time. Time is the main problem.
It's very time consuming, but I totally agree. I have very positive experiences with combining my research with students. They appreciate it because they are involved in something and you take them seriously. So this is really a win-win situation, both for students who learn the skills and for us who want to conduct research. So this is really a win-win situation. I don't think everybody uses this method, but I think it's something we should do as a criminological discipline a lot more, because really has more advantages than disadvantages. Enormous amount of research topics which you are involved in and which are being conducted in Slovenia. So it's probably very difficult to say something about, is there a dominant paradigm or not, or is it a combination of but maybe you can, if you look at it from a historical point of view, say something about the, I mean, and by paradigm, I just mean research tradition. I mean, or research schools. Just maybe easier than paradigm.
Okay. I will try to be short because I think this is a topic for a very long discussion, and maybe my colleagues wouldn't agree with me fully. You know, criminology has always contributed to a humanistic approach in dealing with crime, criminals, deviants, and so on. That's one of the reasons for it is that we have a scientific field in Slovenia, which is called criminology and social work. And the main idea of criminology is that we need to deal with what in English they say root causes of crime. And it's mainly about social policy. And it's about the quality of life of people. In the past, there was almost no what we know as situational crime prevention. You know, you couldn't find any writing about it until the 80s. So it was mainly about the protection of children. So if you remember what I talked before about the early 30s, about the founder of Slovenian criminology, it was a child protection policies. It was about helping families, and it was also after the World War II when, you know, there were tragic consequences, if you know, family fathers died in the war and so on, and all kinds of social problems later on, and the main idea was also about the creation of proper social policy. Democratization of our country. In the 90s, we started talking about leftist or right perspectives in understanding social problems and so on. And I can tell you nowadays, in Slovenia, we can find all kinds of perspectives. But still, I always warn my colleagues when they write the interpretation of their results. They have to be aware that criminological research has some impact on policy making, and it usually deals with the governmental perspectives. And it has some policy implications. And if I remember correctly, a statement of Professor Alenka Šelich some time ago, she said that in the past, the government took criminological and criminal law research seriously, but nowadays media perspectives are prevailing, and everybody or everyone can be an expert in crime, criminals, and so on. And it can be often a matter of public debate, even if scientific research shows something completely opposite. So from my perspective, I would say that the quality of criminological research has been good, of a high quality, but there is something what on top of everything what we do, we need to learn some skills how to present our research results to the wider public, because otherwise our impact is quite limited. So it's, in my case, I think I have quite a good impact on my students, at least to the time when they have to take my exam. I don't know what happens afterwards. We also have to have some impact on the development of research or knowledge, criminological knowledge globally with our publications, citations, and so on. Because if we don't do that, and if you don't get cited, you don't get research projects, or you don't get promoted. But there is also the third component, which is emphasized in the Bologna Convention of Higher Education. We have to contribute to the development and growth of our communities. we know that we have, I still remember from a book of my mentor Janez Pečar, that there were 94 definitions of a community. I think it's about so-called research-based policy making, or research-based decision making, or research-based improvement of practice, and so on. I edited conference proceedings in 2018. The title of it was something like Between Common Sense and Evidence-Based Decision Making or Policy Making. And we learned that policymakers, and every one of us, but we focus on the policymakers and practitioners, are slaves of so-called bounded rationality. Yeah. So we all want to have rational arguments to make the best possible decisions. But when we try to do so, we see that we, as a policymaker who mainly serve governments and politicians, are also influenced by the values of political parties, by the priorities of the government, by some public debates on a specific topic, and so on. So, and then you see that a lot of your precious research somehow disappears or loses in its impact. So you have to try hard to learn and convince them, that it should be good. But there's another problem, because when it comes to governments, they function on the basis of a 4-year term, and it depends at what stage of their term you enter in this, I call it a dance, a policy-making dance. So is it, if it's in the beginning of their term, or is it at the end of their term, or there are some prospects for the continuation of their term in the future, and so on. So from this perspective, I think it's very important, but I always emphasize the ethical perspectives in what we are doing. So you have to be loyal to yourself, and it's about trying to achieve the highest possible standards of research, and you have to present them in the best possible way. But then you also have to know that there's a certain point where your influence actually is zero. Yeah, unless you become a politician.
Yeah, that's of course something completely different, and you're changing positions. But I guess these are challenges we all face, especially nowadays. But you talk about the relationship with the government. Indeed, it really depends on the stage of the 4-year period, and it's very difficult to get long-term influence. I guess this is the main issue. Well, what do you think are the most important challenges for Slovenian criminology to make it as a discipline, an ongoing, evolving discipline in the near future? You talked about the international component. Are there any specific other issues which you think are important challenges nowadays?
Okay, so I think that one of the biggest challenges at the moment, normalization after the COVID pandemic, because of the changing patterns of daily routines of people. And we know that some patterns of crime have changed recently because of changing habits. And, we spent a lot of time at home, or shopping, or almost all shopping moved on the internet, and so on. People became a little bit more distant so we are not, so we stopped socializing and spending so much time with other colleagues and acquaintances as in the past, and people spent more time with their families, and they were frustrated by a lack of success of their children, or by schooling online, and so on, and so all kinds of pressures. We also know that we have this new phenomenon of depressed kids who are waiting for clinical psychological treatment for about 1.5 years, sometimes even 2 years. So there's not enough experts who could give psychological help to the youngsters, which are the future of our nation, actually any nation, you know. There's also a problem which actually disappeared from the public media during the pandemic, is migration problems, because we received completely different information about the amount and extent of migration to our country and over our country during different governments. So, and I think it's also about the perspective of human rights, you know, so it's about universal human rights that need to be taken into consideration, because this right-wing movement, actually extremism, radicalization of some specific groups can grow bigger and bigger, because, you know, if we take into consideration the conflict or a war between Ukraine and Russia that has probably some impact on the European Union and maybe wider. And we know that there are some latent variables we have no control over, you know, so it's quite unpredictable what is going to happen. Even in the vicinity of our country, you probably follow this the news about political problems in the Balkans. So we have always been somehow impacted by what was going on in the Balkan region, and you can see that there's a quite a big conflict between Serbia and Kosovo at the moment, and you never know what it brings in the future. What I think is necessary to do now in the future for the development of criminology, criminological thought and criminological research, is to invest into young scholars, yeah, and try to help them as much as possible to fully develop their potential. Exactly the same happened to me by coincidence in 1995. I never had a plan to be a researcher or academic, but I was sent to this School of Internal Affairs in 1992 because I had worked in the police force before, and I was in a group of 10 youngsters who were a kind of an investment of the Ministry of the Interior for the future. And the director of the education center of the police at the time said, Meško, we will send you to this School of Internal Affairs. You will finish some master studies. You will learn 1 or 2, maybe 3 languages. And when you're ready, you will become a big chief in the Ministry of the Interior. So that was his planned trajectory for me. But out of, I think it was 10 of us, just 2 of us are still working in the same institution after 30 years. One of them is Bojan Doboš, a colleague of mine who does organized crime, and me. So we probably haven't been good enough to leave the academic field and become policymakers, practitioners, I don't know, bureaucrats, whatever. And we are still learning. And I actually found this trajectory, an unplanned trajectory of my career as the greatest gift of all in my life, because it's a privilege to work with young people because you stay young. If you work with researchers from all over the world, you actually immediately learn how little you know, and that there's a lot more to learn. I have always been happy to meet great people from whom I learned a little bit, and from some of them I learned a lot. It's really good, and I was surprised in September this year when I learned that I've been working in this school for 30 years. So this was very interesting. And I remember, Marcelo, when you were very young, when you took over the position of Secretary General of the European Society of Criminology. And it's very interesting that we still feel young, but when people talk to us, they show us a lot of respect, but I don't know why, because of our seniority or because we are so good. Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, you made a nice overview of the situation and in Slovenia. You think that in the former Yugoslavia, when you had this national institute, you think that the government was paying more attention to that, or because it was done by themselves, or was it a way of controlling what was said about crime?
So you mean nationalism in specific republics, or?
No, what I mean is they created this institute in 1950 something.
Yeah.
What was the goal of creating the institute in your opinion?
Okay, so the main idea was, I read all documents. The main idea to establish the Institute of Criminology in Ljubljana, yeah, if you're talking about the Institute of Criminology, was to have proper research done by researchers outside the government, in an academic environment. From that perspective, I would say that was very democratic. Yeah. Even if people say that it was an authoritarian state and so on, but even in authoritarian countries, you have people who are very advanced and who have a great vision for the future. Yeah. And I think that it was really a good decision. Yeah.
Okay.
And but there were also institutes in other republics, but it was not exactly the same. So they followed different schools, or they did different research, or they were extremely empirical or philosophical or very legal and so on. So it really depended on who the researchers were in these institutes and what school of thought they followed. For example, at the Institute of Criminology, in their early stages of development, they followed this school of social defense, new school of social defense. That was the main idea for some time, And for example, they also contributed to some changes in the criminal justice system, because up to 1968, prisons were under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of the Interior. So from 1968, prisons are under the jurisdiction of the Ministry of Justice. And there were also some other changes, which I would say that they had quite a huge impact on to move towards the idea of that were typical for other democratic countries. So that was the main idea.
Okay.
From my perspective.
So, but when you entered criminology, Slovenia was already an independent country, because it was at the beginning of the 90s, eh?
Yeah, I finished my BA in 1991.
Just.
And then I finished masters in 94 and PhD in 98, yes.
And did you feel a big change from what was going on just before the independence? I'm thinking about the kind of handbooks that were used, or the kind of theories that were taught.
Theories in the textbooks were, I would say, typical Western theory. I still remember one conflict the Slovenian criminologists had, I think, with criminologists from DDR, from Eastern Germany, about the causes of crime, because they follow this Eastern European communist idea that in communist countries there is no crime, and crime exists only in capitalist country because of the conflict between, capital and people, and abuse and use and so on. And the Slovenian researchers opposed these perspectives very strongly. Yeah. And I can tell you that even in the textbook from 1968 was very modern. And just an example from 1973, another mentor of mine, and also another one, Janez Pečar and Vinko Skalar published a booklet for police officers published by the Federal Secretariat of Internal Affairs in Belgrade in Serbian language. Yeah. And it was, I think the title of the booklet was Police and the Public. Yeah. And it was very advanced publication, very open, very humane, and it was all about what we now can find in textbooks about community policing, showing people respect, following basic principles of etiquette, being professional. It also went into those teeny tiny details, how to wear a uniform, how to treat yourself, and so on and so on. But anyway, it was what we now discuss in the field of community policing, legitimate policing, and so on. It was. I published a piece about this publication and the role of one of the professors, one of the co-authors, Fallschrift, because those two guys were extremely before the time. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that it's impressive that we are learning with this podcast is the huge diversity that existed in the area that was under the rule, let's say, of the Soviet Union. I mean, the situation was quite different in Poland than in Hungary, than in Slovenia, than inside former Yugoslavia. People tend to put together groups, like South America, all the countries are the same, they are completely different, or there are a lot of differences. And now we are learning also about these differences in Central and Eastern Europe. And one thing that I've been thinking, especially what you're saying now, is Slovenia became integrated with, let's say, with the Western countries much quicker than the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. In terms, I'm thinking about, let's talk about crime, the different thing in terms of prison population rates and crime rates, and I think that also the education that you were receiving was much closer to the Western education. So the country was really, of course, you are in the border there, but that must have helped a lot, because the situation that we heard about in other Central and Eastern European countries was quite different, and the influence of the Marxist criminology, of this idea that in the beginning there was no crime and then capitalism was like the original sin. Yeah. So it is quite interesting, I think, to see this difference and this openness also to the other countries that you explained before. It's not really a question; it's just a reflection on just to put in context what you've been saying.
I think that we also, when we discuss continents, regions, we use so-called cognitive shortcuts. We simplify things.
Yeah.
And in this regard, especially about Central Eastern Europe, because I co-edited a book on the development of policing in Central Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, because some Western colleagues from the West believe that Eastern Europe is one entity, and I called it was wrong homogeneity hypothesis, because it's not. It's so different cultures. It's about different developments and so on. And if we go back to the 1948, when all other Eastern European, except Yugoslavia, that belonged to the Eastern Bloc, followed the Russian model of communism, and the President Tito at the time, he resisted the Russian influence, and we had a completely different political and social arrangement, still socialist and so on, but very much different. And many people from the East believed that Yugoslavia was a kind of semi-socialist, semi-communist, because we had in addition to public ownership, we also had private ownership, and we had private companies and all kinds of industry, which is quite similar to the one in present time. But transition was not easy, you know, because I remember times when we were a candidate for joining the EU. I have to emphasize that Slovenia is a very small system, yeah. And when we talk about people who cover a specific area, we usually cover more than one, yeah. And some important pillars of the system usually depend on one or two people. So we don't have many replacements, you know. That's something different in huge countries and in huge systems. And I remember when I attended, when I was still working at the Ministry of the Interior in 2000, I attended twinning meetings, you know, in the field of police education, and another one was about crime prevention. I was a one-man band, yeah. I had colleagues with me from the ministries and so on, but they didn't study the topic in detail, you know, because they were specialists in some other fields, and some of them were experts for everything. So that was, and I just finished my postdoc research in Cambridge in 2001. I wrote a book on basics of crime prevention, and I was a member of this team for some more than 2 years, and I was the only who actually was able to discuss, you know, those perspectives of crime prevention in the future, actually, or at the time. And about police education, we also had a very interesting debate. It was the idea about abandoning some not so bad practices because I don't know what reasons and so on. So it's all about social development and the changing nature of social control and the role of police in society and other agencies and so on, you know. And it sometimes happens that we members of an academic, the academic community, we have very little impact on this because practitioners attend those meetings abroad. They come back home, they introduce some practices, and then after 2 or 3 years we learn that it's not so good. But anyway, you know, it happens because it's universal, it's good for anything. Sometimes I call it McDonaldization of social control, because everything should work everywhere and so on. But we don't have time to test those ideas in practice, and you know, so sometimes we don't even have institutional and other capacity, you know. We simply go with the flow, you know. But we still have some remainings, especially in the field of penal policy, remainings of rehabilitative orientation and not so harsh punishment. So it's reflected in the numbers, you know, when we compare our statistics and so on. But yeah, but processes are different, you know. Our picture is very similar to the Scandinavian one, but the processes behind are different. Yeah, so that is something what I think is it's worth to discuss when it comes to professional debate. And because when we see, oh, we have the same imprisonment rate, we have this indicator that are about the same, but it's not the same story behind it.
There is also one question that we like to ask to our guests is how crime has changed in your country during your lifetime, because we all belong to a generation that went through this huge change in Europe.
So this is a very difficult question because I cannot give you a completely reliable and valid answer, you know. But from a personal perspective, I would say that what is the most intriguing, that there's quite a big tolerance for economic crime and crimes of social elites, and not so big tolerance for crimes of the poor. Yeah, because if we take a look at the penal statistics, especially at demographic characteristics of prisoners, we still see that the majority of prisoners are poor people who sometimes steal because they have to steal. We have people in prisons who sometimes belong to mental hospitals and are victims of their despair or inability to solve conflicts, or victims of their cultures, or better said, subcultures, and so on. It's also related to the ability of the law enforcement and criminal justice system to investigate, prosecute, and convict highly sophisticated crimes. It's quite universal. Criminals have always been a step forward, and it's very difficult to catch them. They, especially organized criminals, are highly professionalized. I think it's especially in the field of sophisticated modern cyber and other crimes, the state formal social control agents, be the police or detectives or all these kinds of investigators, have to catch up the mentality of criminals and still have a challenge to learn a lot. And one of the criticisms of my students in the past was that we mainly talk about criminology or history of criminology. And one of the students said, why wouldn't we think about the future of crime and criminal activity and try to be creative? I think this is a very good perspective, but it's a challenge for the young people because I'm probably too conservative, and my knowledge about this cyber and other perspectives is quite limited. Yeah, and especially when it comes to economic crimes and some very specific forms of crime. I usually talk about two different kinds of people who teach criminology. You have people who are generalists, who know a little bit about every topic, and they can enter into a quite limited discussion. And then you have top specialists who know almost everything about a very specific, very narrow topic. And my idea I call it to spice up teaching, is to invite those specialists to my criminology classes, my victimology, and other classes I teach, because they are fully acquainted with the state of the art of affairs at the present time. And especially, we sometimes underestimate police officers, prosecutors, and others about their knowledge and about their experience about what is going on in the field of crime and social control. And my experience is that whenever we invite those practitioners, we learn a lot from them. So that's what I think is very important.
You gave me a very nice answer about what we should do, but what we were thinking is what changed in crime, for example. And you were in a perfect position because in the times of former Yugoslavia, you were at the beginning working as a police officer. So I was wondering the kind of crimes that were committed there. I'm thinking about
I think that the patterns are about the same. One of the research projects in the 70s, conducted, I think, by Katja Vodopivec, showed that that's impossible at the present time to think about it, was that I think that 2/3 of people who committed property crime returned the stolen things to the owners before they went to the court. So nowadays, I cannot imagine it. So if you read that piece of research, you said, but this is a fairy tale. Yeah, it's impossible. But, I remember what is the main difference. I cannot say if there is more crime or less or what, but it was about all kinds of pressures by informal social control. First of all, it was just one political party, and many people were members of this political party. And if you didn't behave well, you were excluded from the party. and it was not good to be excluded at the time. Yeah. And there was also belief that this public property, yeah, or working class people's property, actually people's property, is very important. And this was another pressure, yeah, and all kinds of pressure about right and wrong, be it formally and informally, yeah. And I think that informal pressures were even stronger than formal, yeah, because criminal justice system has always had some limits regarding its efficiency. What has changed after 1991? So I think that we are, especially when it comes to the formal social control, so the role of institutions like the police, especially the police, is that we have more police officers, we have more private security people, and we also have more crime registered by the police. And it's also very interesting that even if we faced a drop in the reported or recorded crime, more and more people are working in the field of policing, law enforcement, and private security, and so on. So I think it's a market. It's a market of protective services, which plays a significant role to protect some people from crime, yeah, especially the well-off. And we also have NGOs that help those who do not have anything, and usually rely on goodwill and charitable and friendly, supportive people who feel so-called social responsibility to help others. And we also have state agencies that have some limits in responding to some crimes. So if we compare police statistics and victimization surveys, which give us some idea about the dark numbers of crime, I can tell you that we do not have a proper victimization survey since 2000. So we just have partial ones, but not a general one. But we had those surveys also in the previous system. It was not called a victimization survey, but it was called a study on dark figures of crime. And it showed about the same patterns of non-reported crimes like in the present time. So no big differences. So reasons are about the same. And but I don't know exactly. I don't remember exactly the numbers or ratio between the reported crimes and dark figures of crime. So it was. So the main difference between the previous system and now is that we do not have political prisoners. That was the case before 1991, and also. A structure of criminal offenses, actually definitions of criminal offenses in the field of white-collar crimes have changed, because before 1991 we had this different kind of economy. It was a planned economy, and the economic system was quite different. After 1991, when we became a young democracy, young capitalist country, we also had to adapt our legislation to other Western legislations in this field. And what is very interesting, so far, if I remember correctly, we had just one person who held PhD in economics to work in the field of criminological research. And she left the field very soon, because criminology is not a lucrative discipline.
Okay. Okay, and just I was thinking about two crimes, like domestic violence, and the other one is drugs, because I had the impression that alcohol was there, but then there was some sort of change. Am I wrong about that?
No, you are right. So if we talk about the domestic violence, so the first debates on the protection of children's rights started in the mid-80s, And those children's rights were not meant to spoil children, but to protect them from all kinds of violence and to provide them with a safe environment to grow up and become healthy and useful adults. So that was the main idea. At the same time, efforts to efficiently respond on domestic violence cases also started. I remember that in the beginning of 90s, we had the first seminars on the protection of children, on the role of police and social workers in case of domestic violence and so on. I can tell you that it took us about 35 years to establish quite an effective system. And I attended a meeting in the east of Slovenia, in Murska Sobota, one of the regional towns, where they presented the work of a team that deals with domestic violence. And I can tell you it's a very professional group of people consisting of police officers, specialists, prosecutors, doctors, medical doctors, of course, social workers and others who actually deal with every specific case, and they decide, I would say, in the way that decision must be in the best interest of the victims and especially children. And when they presented the way they dealt with some cases, I was really happy for them and also for victims if this was the way they did their work, because this is really a huge progress. But it took them about 30 years to develop this field, yeah. And in the meantime, the Slovenian parliament adopted a piece of legislation on domestic violence and so on. And also this restraining order was one of the measures that they implemented, have been implementing since then and so on. Yeah, so this is, I would say, a huge progress in comparison to the 80s, when I would say that if a woman came to a police station and reported this kind of crime, sometimes people would laugh at her or blame her for being victimized and so on. So this culture has changed. And in regard to violence in general, I think that the Slovenian community has shown that there's a very low level of tolerance for violence. Yeah, there is still some, but it's like everywhere. But it's it has reduced significantly. Yeah, and about drugs. So if I go to the prison, yeah, when I went to prison. When I did my first research in the central prison of Slovenia for about 3 years, I did many interviews, and I studied prisoners' lifestyle and their criminal careers between 92 and 94. The main problem of, I would say, an average prisoner in Slovenia was abuse of alcohol or alcoholism. Yeah. Nowadays, it's not alcohol or alcoholism, it's mainly drugs. Yeah, all kinds of drugs. So it's about, on the one hand, we have people who are drug addicts, and on the other hand, we have people who are drug dealers. Yeah, and I think that this problem of drugs in relation to crime has increased, and it's also reflected in some police unit because they have specialists in this field when it comes to law enforcement. But we also have had, I would say, a very interesting development of ideas on treatment of addicts and so on. But that's the question for the psychiatric seminar or something like that, because we have different ideas about it. It's about, one of them is harm reduction, another one is zero tolerance, and so on. So it's still, I would say, this idea are still developing. There's no the final answer about it, but the drug related crimes are more and more present. Yes, that's another problem. Yeah.
Okay, and related to that because you mentioned the composition of the prison population, Slovenia is known for having a very low prison population rate, but how has this changed again during your lifespan, let's say? But in terms of numbers, but also in terms of composition. For example, in Switzerland, there were major changes. For example, in terms of non-Swiss citizens in prison.
Yeah. Okay. So you just addressed me as a very old person, you know. Okay. So the main difference, yeah, in the structure of demographic structure of prisoners is related nowadays just in one prison. It's more foreigners, but it's related to the Schengen border of Slovenia because of trafficking in human beings, especially smuggling refugees or migrants and so on. And those people do not come only from the region or from Slovenia, but also from other regions like Asia and so on. And this causes quite a big conflict to the prison staff because mainly because of cultural differences and especially because of the language of these people. Yeah, this has changed in regard to the Schengen border, which you know that now is moving to Croatia, you know, further on, you know, with the Croatian borders with Serbia and Bosnia and Montenegro and so on. So that's it. And in the past, you know, if I go back before 1991, we mainly had prisoners from Yugoslavia or Slovenia. Majority was Slovenians. Then we had more, but not so many prisoners from abroad, from neighboring countries and so on. From time to time, we had some people from very unusual countries who committed some criminal offenses in Slovenia and stayed in the Slovenian prisons. But I would say that apart from this prison in Koper in the west of Slovenia at the seaside, the structure is still about the same, but there's a little bit more foreigners, not that high numbers like in some other states, which is 50% on something. So we are not there yet. Yeah. But I also have to let you know something, because when we started doing this study on penal policy, we learned something very interesting, that sometimes on an annual basis, around 70% of convicts get a suspended sentence. That's also very important to mention, because the Slovenian prison system is still a little bit overcrowded, but imagine that those convicts would get imprisonment. So this would change the picture of the Slovenian prisons completely. Then we could say that we are quite a repressive country, you know. Yeah. So this is very tricky.
And do you think that before 1990, these suspended sentences existed also, or?
Yeah, they existed, but I never studied these sentences for the time before 91. Yes, they existed. Yeah.
Because I have the impression sometimes that the change is that some people, especially the local ones that were formerly sent to prison, are no longer being sent now. I mean, if you are from the country where you have an advantage, let's say, because you must do something really bad to go to prison, and this would explain much more, I think. But of course, we need to study that. It's an hypothesis.
You know, the present options are also consist of these intermediate sanctions, you know.
Yeah.
And I would say quite many offenders get like a weekend prison. Some of them get community service, and some of them are sent directly to an open department of a prison, and it's all kind of approaches, So we also have this restorative justice or mediation, which is on the under the jurisdiction of a prosecutor when they see whether this person could be given another chance and so on. But it depends on the reaction of the victim. But anyway, it's so I think that legal options are about the same as in the majority of Western countries. But apart from some intermediate sanctions, the idea of punishment and it was about the same before 1991. Yes.
Okay.
And one of the, I would say, important pieces of heritage of colleagues from the Institute of Criminology, who were mainly criminal lawyers. So it was a mix, because many of them worked full-time at the chair of criminal law, and were also work at the Institute of Criminology, and their idea when it came to punishing people was that the punishment must be the last resort. If we compare Slovenia to other retentionist countries, where they executed the death penalty, so the last one was executed in the 50s. It was still in legislation. We had it till 1989. It was never executed after, I think, 57 or 59. Yeah.
Okay.
But it was not the case in other republics of Yugoslavia at the time. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Well, from my side, Lieven, I think we have covered almost everything that we wanted. I don't know if you have a couple of more questions, or at least one. Maybe something escaped.
No, I think we covered all and a lot more, of course. So this is a very rich interview. So I think this is highly informative, and our listeners will be very glad to learn about both the history of criminology, the kinds of research, the relation with policy challenges. I think we should thank you very much, Gorazd, for your time and for having prepared this wonderful interview. Thanks a lot. And we hope, of course, to discuss some of these issues later on, because these are so complicated topics.
Yeah.
We'll talk about them also when we meet, as you said, live again at conferences after the pandemic. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Gorazd. Thank you.
Thank you, Lieven and Marcelo, for being patient. And thank you for asking very interesting questions that triggered my thinking about some possible research projects in the future.
That's good.
That's a win-win situation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much.
Thank you for following Lieven and Marcelo's Criminology podcast. This podcast is edited by Eduardo Coco from the University of Lausanne. Our theme song is Seagull's Night, Noche de Gaviotas, composed by Gustavo Cantero, arranged by Tato Germano, and played by Tato and Gustavo with the voices of Sasha Conte and Alejandro Turco Gujot. Your host are Lieven Pauwels from Ghent University, Belgium, and Marcelo Evi from the University of Lausanne, Switzerland. Cheers, and see you soon.